Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second session of the Local Waterfront Revitalization Program training series. Today, we'll be talking about the boundary of the waterfront revitalization area, which is included in your LWRP. So in this presentation, we'll talk about the background from the New York State Coastal Management Program, about how the boundary is set, the purpose of the boundary, requirements for the LWRP boundary, and then guidelines about the landward side and the water side in both coastal municipalities and inland waterway municipalities, since they're slightly different. And then how to present the LWRP boundary in the LWRP document and some resources for you. So the Coastal Management Program was developed between 1974 and 1982. It took 8 years to complete. And while they were developing that Coastal Management Program, they had to decide where that boundary was going to be, where the coastal boundary would lie. So they came up with some criteria, since the state is so diverse, that the boundary needed to conform with nearest cultural features such as roads, railroads, utility right-of-way, political boundaries such as villages or cities or town boundaries, that it should include all land and water uses that impact the coastal waters. And then they decided that they would recommend that it could be a buffer of up to 1,000 feet for either aesthetic or other reasons, such as including cultural or natural features. So we'll talk about those. So some of those features would be specially designated management areas. So for example, this photo on the slide is the French Creek Marsh, significant coastal fish and wildlife habitat that's up on the St. Lawrence River in northern New York. And those significant coastal habitats are actually designated under Article 42 of the executive law. So there's a special habitat narrative and map for each of those significant habitats. So those areas need to be included in the coastal boundary and also in your LWRP boundary. The coastal boundary should include all coastal waters, barrier islands, bays, harbors, shallow areas, marshes, and tributaries that lie within the coastal boundary. So the waterfront revitalization area boundary should also include those important water bodies. Then another criteria is that special areas should be included, such as agricultural lands, view sheds, power plant sites. So in the coastal management program, it was determined that 50 megawatt plants or more, the larger ones, should be included. Historic sites, industrial areas, and then the FEMA 100-year floodplains and any recreation areas. So then by default, the LWRP boundary should also consider these particular resources. So you should draw it with those areas in mind. The data for this information is available on our Geographic Information Gateway. Hopefully, some or most of you have taken a look at that. There's a lot of information on there. Within that, you can get to it at that link, and it shows the coastal area and a lot of the other resources that we'll be talking about throughout this training. So I encourage you to go on the Gateway and take a look at that when you get a chance. The boundary, again, right now we're talking about the original coastal area, as I said, is codified in Article 42. And there's a definition of the coastal area, which says the state's coastal waters and the adjacent shorelines, including landlocked waters and subterranean waters, to the extent such coastal waters and adjacent lands are strongly influenced by each other. So that's our mantra for defining our waterfront areas. They need to be influenced by each other. This is the Waterfront Revitalization Program. So that's the purpose of defining the boundary and the land and water uses within it. And then section 911.2, the coastal area boundaries, and 914, the boundaries prepared by the Secretary of State. And that were then adopted as part of Article 42 when the CMP was put in place. So it's an official coastal boundary. Why is this boundary so important? The coastal policies apply within that coastal area, and then when we get to talking about inland waterways, within the inland waterway area. And those policies, which we'll talk about in two sessions from now, are regulatory statements of action that are based on state laws and are used to help make decisions about actions within the coastal area, permits, funding, and other actions. So the boundary is very important for those reasons. As a reminder, and for some of you that might not have been here last week, the coastal area is everything on this slide that's outlined in yellow highlight. And it's, as you can see, Long Island Sound, Atlantic Ocean, the Hudson River up to the Troy Dam, which is the tidal portion of the Hudson River. Then over on the west, Lake Erie, Lake Ontario, goes up into the St. Lawrence River, is part of the coastal area. In New York City, the definition in Article 42, Section 911 includes the East River, the Harlem River, the Kill, Von Kull, and Arthur Kill. And they're connecting water bodies, bays, harbors, shallows, and marshes. So that's the original coastal area. So when we're talking about the coastal boundary, and when we get into talking about LWRPs, that's what we start with, is those yellow highlighted areas. The purpose of the boundary, it clearly defines the LWRP as land and waterside areas for that community, the legal limits of jurisdiction of that local waterfront revitalization program, and the policies and projects that the community puts in place. It should include areas that can contribute to and benefit from the LWRP vision. So you might have open space areas that the municipality would like to work on or improve or perhaps just preserve in the future. So it's connected to the vision for your community. Where do we get the requirements and guidelines that we're providing to you today and in our new guidance that we just sent out? Well, it's really an update of the older guidance, but Article 42 says that for LWRPs, the Secretary shall prepare, and that's the Secretary of State, shall prepare guidelines and regulations for LWRPs, not limited to boundaries. So we interpret that as this guidance that we've developed. There's in the original coastal management program, there's guidance for LWRPs in an appendix to the CMP. That was way back in the 1980s. There was a guidance put out around 1990. Then we updated it in 2018, and now we're updating it again in 2024. So these guidelines are the guidelines in the guidance you got last night are the guidelines that we use for coastal area boundary and in the waterway boundaries. So let's start to get into starting with the landward boundary. Where's that line going to be on the upland area in coastal communities? So in the coastal area, we start with the New York State coastal boundary, that yellow area I showed in the previous slide. In this slide, this is in the town of Cape Vincent up in the St. Lawrence River. And the crosshatched area is the existing coastal boundary within the town of Cape Vincent. In this case, we're going to use this as an example throughout the PowerPoint today. The village of Cape Vincent did one of the early LWRPs in the 1980s. A few years ago, the town of Cape Vincent decided they wanted to join with the village and create a joint town and village LWRP. However, the town also adopts it separately. Each municipality adopts it separately, but they can work together to prepare the LWRP. So the town had to figure out, okay, where's our boundary going to be for our LWRP? So again, they started with a coastal boundary, which is a crosshatched area. Then what the guidelines say is look for important resources, areas that are affected by the waterfront, especially water dependent and water enhanced uses. So what do you think water dependent uses are in these two photos? I can see a couple water dependent uses. And then what are water enhanced uses? And these terms are used throughout the coastal management program, the CMP, and the policies that you used to do your own local consistency reviews. So those two terms are part of the basis of the coastal management program. So we have fishing, of course, is a water dependent use. Boating in the top slide. If there's an erosion control structure along the shore, could be thought of as a water dependent use. But the park, what do you think about that? No, it's not a water dependent use. You don't have to have water to have a park, but it's a water enhanced use. It's much nicer having it right next to the water. So what our program does is we prioritize water dependent uses over water enhanced and other uses. So, you can have both, but if there's a water dependent use that is available for that area, that should be prioritized. So when you're thinking about the boundary, these are things to think about. Also, look for natural and cultural resources that have a relationship to the waterfront. This is the Seaway Trail Discovery Center in Sackett's Harbor up on Lake Ontario. So that's an example of that. In our example of the town of Cape Vincent, we have the Tibbetts Point Lighthouse is a resource that they should include within their waterfront revitalization area. It's already in the coastal area, but so it's just an example of something that you would look for. And then we have our significant coastal fish and wildlife habitats, and those are those irregular areas outlined in green. These are really important to treat in the LWRP. In all the sections, section 1, boundary, section 2, inventory and analysis, section 3, you could refer to them in the coastal policies that relate to the, we call them SIGHABs. Section 4, if there's a project proposed, they need to take into account the significant coastal habitats. These are areas where plants and animals have been especially found to be important habitat areas for those plants and animals. These are available on our website on the Coastal Atlas. So there's, you can see in Cape Vincent, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, possibly 6 of these SIGHABs. So they're very important up in Cape Vincent. Then areas necessary to achieve the policies of the LWRP. So are there vacant parcels that the community wants to develop? Floodplains to protect for floodplain management and to prevent flooding into the community. That's in the city of Poughkeepsie in Dutchess County, where I live. Then some recommendations and guidelines for how to draw that boundary so that it's easier for implementation of the LWRP and the review of projects. So follow those roads or railroads, utility right-of-ways, or if it's a small village, could be the municipal boundary. So here in the town of Penfield, up on Lake Ontario, they followed the major roadways. The red line there is their waterfront revitalization area, which follows roadways to be able to be more easily implemented. And then a term that we use a lot is it needs to be drawn to reflect a nexus between activities in the upland and on the water side. So again, this is the Waterfront Revitalization Program, and that's the purpose of putting together these plans. So this example in the town and village of Clayton, it's similar to Cape Vincent in that the village of Clayton up on the St. Lawrence River did an LWRP way back in the 1980s. When they did their first LWRP, they decided that they wanted to add an area. The original coastal area is that black dotted line or black hashed line. And then if you can see where there's dots instead of hatch marks, they wanted to expand it over to the right, over to the east, to add this area. So in order to do that, they need to come up with a justification for why they want to do that. And for Clayton, what they said was it encompasses wetlands and associated upland areas that drain into the French Creek. So the French Creek is one of those SIGHABs, significant coastal fish and wildlife habitats. It goes way over to the west here. I'll show you a map in a minute. But what they identified is this additional sort of trapezoidal area was really important to protect the significant habitat. Also included some brushlands and inactive agricultural lands, and also some existing commercial and residential lands, which were directly related to waterfront activities. So, and they needed to write this justification in the LWRP to show us why they wanted to expand the coastal area. They did that, and it was approved, and they said that it would help them with continuity in waterfront planning efforts and enable additional public access to be considered to the waterfront by adding that area. Then later on, similar to Cape Vincent, the town of Clayton decided they wanted to do an LWRP and join with the village in a joint LWRP. Again, the town has to adopt it on their own as well, but they did some joint planning to update the village's LWRP and then do a town LWRP. So that for the town, okay, where are they going to draw their boundary? This is a little bit different than other areas of the state, because you will know that the red boundary of these towns along the St. Lawrence River goes to the Canadian border. So what our law says that it can be to the municipal boundary or 1,500 feet from the boundary, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. But for the purposes of the town of Clayton, their waterside boundary goes up to the border with Canada, because that's where their municipal boundary goes. They also are including the French Creek and Marsh significant coastal fish and wildlife habitat. As you can see, that's much bigger than just the little portion that was in the village. And I also want to point out, if you look over to the left-hand side of the slide, the town of Cape Vincent is to the left. The boundary for Clayton stops at the boundary with the town of Cape Vincent. It's always within that municipality. You can't have a boundary spill over into another municipality. Each municipality has their own LWRP and their own boundary. They can have a joint LWRP with some of the sections shared, but they need to have each adopted separately locally. And then you can see this little corner down here with the French Creek Marsh. That little corner is actually in the town of Cape Vincent. And the red line is the town of Clayton's waterfront revitalization area. Again, that's important when projects come up and you're reviewing them for consistency with the LWRP. And then over on the landward side, you can see it parallels the Route 12 and 12F. I'm not sure how many feet that is off Route 12 and 12F, but this was, they preserved the original coastal boundary. So perhaps it's 1,000 feet, I'm not sure. But so the town of Clayton's actually mirrors the original coastal boundary. They didn't make any changes when they did their coastal boundary, their LWRP boundary. So let's switch to inland waterway communities. We don't have the coastal boundary to start with, so it's a little more challenging. As those of you on the training, some of you have been involved in communities where this gets to be challenging. What we do is we say that the CMP guidelines can be our guide to start with. So we can start with 1,000 feet from the waterway. The guidelines say in urban areas, you may want to delineate 500 feet from the waterway or where there's a roadway or railroad line, but it can be more than 500 feet as long as there's a justification. Also, where there's major state-owned lands or facilities or power facilities, again, this is similar to the coastal boundary guidelines, include them, encompass significant resources such as scenic value, agricultural land, recreation, major tributary and lands around them. Again, only draw the boundary to the extent necessary to control the shorelands and waters that are strongly influenced by each other. This is because our program is based in Article 42 and the 600 regulations. That's why we have these guidelines. To help with the inland waterway delineation for the LWRP boundary, we have developed a flow chart and a checklist. So I'm going to show you a little more about these. However, again, even though there's a checklist, there needs to be a rationale and a relationship to include a resource. For example, if there's a waterfront park or a park adjacent to a downtown area near the waterfront, it would probably be good to include those within the boundary. But if there's a park on the other side of town that's not connected to the waterfront at all, that would not be something that you'd include in the boundary. So this worksheet is a fillable PDF and it's in Appendix 5 of the new guidance. And, you know, it has you check off and list different resources, beaches, wetlands, floodplains, view sheds, agricultural lands, historical sites, things like that. An optional way to do this, couple communities have done an additional sheet. So if you have a lot of historic sites, this is just, again, for the boundary. You can add supplemental information when you're submitting this boundary to us and say, this is why we wanted to expand it here, because we have these listed historic sites or other important properties. But I wanted to note that, you know, we're just now talking about Section 1 at the moment. When you get to Section 2 of the LWRP, there will be a lot more data gathering. And at that point, you may want to revise the boundary, and that's okay. It's an iterative process. So in this first stage, you're gathering preliminary data and coming up with a proposed boundary, you know, to show the public and to show us. And then after your first public meeting, people from the community may come up with ideas of what to include. And you may, you know, start gathering more data, and you might need to expand it somewhat. Again, remembering that everything will need to be justified if it's expanded for a coastal area or for an inland waterway area. We kind of look at everything that you're including and what your justification is. Then we also have a flow chart we developed to help with the inland waterway boundary. And what this does, again, this is in our guidance, the new guidance in Appendix 5. So what this does just kind of helps you, after you've completed the worksheet, you look to see if it's less than or equal to 1,000 feet on the left here, then ask yourself, have you considered inclusion of the different resources that you found? Does it need to be a little bit more than 1,000 feet? If it's more than 1,000 feet, do you have justification for why you're including those resources? Because we're going to ask for that. when you submit it to us. Then keeping going on the flow chart, is it demarcated by a nearest recognizable landmark or roadway or utility right of way or municipal boundary? Is there something that'll make a, easily determinable on a map boundary for your LWRP? Yes, then you're good to go. No, you might want to think about how to demarcate that, or consult with us as to some ideas of how to do that. And when we get into the more rural areas of the state, that's where this becomes a little more subjective, and feel free to work with us as to how to determine that boundary. So here's some examples. This is the city of Binghamton. And they did an LWRP a while ago, but this just shows the difference in an inland waterway LWRP compared to our coastal examples. So they've got two rivers, and the waterfront revitalization area is along each of those rivers, and that's fine. It's different than the coastal area. It's not just on one side. They looked at natural areas, parks, and open spaces that are in close proximity to the waterfront. They tried to put it on the far side of major roadways when possible, because they wanted to improve access around those roadways. That was one of their goals. They wanted to help people get to the water. They included all recreation-oriented land uses and major existing access points, like one of the pedestrian bridges over the river. And the central business district in the center was included, as well as some pocket commercial areas that could potentially benefit from improvement. So those were their goals for their waterfront boundary. Then the village of Saranac Lake up in the Adirondacks. The Saranac River flows right through the center. And then there's Lake Flower, which is to the south. Their goals were looking at formal and informal trail systems and public access sites to link waterfront land uses and activities. And similarly to Binghamton, the downtown business district is central to the waterfront, where a gathering area for shopping and cultural activities. So those were their justification for including the entire village. Now we're going to switch and talk about the waterside boundary. We've done the landward boundary in coastal and inland areas. For the waterside boundary, we're going to talk about both together, the coastal and inland LWRPs. So for this, what you need to do is start with the official municipal boundary. Sometimes it's at the water's edge. For example, the village of Sackett's Harbor, the boundary of the village is at the water's edge. Sometimes it extends into the water. You may need to research state laws. A village like Sackett's Harbor that goes back to the early 1800s in formation, we helped them, and I actually personally helped them do some research on the boundary of their village, because we need to know where that corporate boundary is in order to have an LWRP. So that's the first step, and that boundary will need to be provided in an appendix to the LWRP, the official boundary of the municipality. Then once you've got your boundary down and you know what that is, and it may sound easy, but sometimes it's not for some of the older municipalities. Then think about the harbor management plan, which, as I mentioned last week, this is now a required portion of the LWRP. And the idea is to look at conflict, congestion, and competition for space within your harbor area. So when we're talking about the waterside boundary, it's important to think about this harbor management area and what's going on there. And that harbor management area needs to be delineated on the boundary map. So just as a reminder, the community adopts the LWRP with the harbor management plan and then approved by the Secretary of State. Once that happens, the municipality has the authority to regulate all structures and uses of waters and underwater lands within a city, town, or village, or abounding that city, town, or village to 1,500 feet. So for Sackett's Harbor, they could delineate that 1,500 feet as it shows in this map, and that area they can regulate, although you can also define a smaller area. So for Sackett's Harbor, where I have that arrow to the left is their harbor, they have a vessel regulation area, which is just the area around and extending out into the bay just a little bit. So even though your harbor management area may be that 1,500 feet area, you can have a smaller defined regulatory area. But another thing to keep in mind is that, especially on Long Island, there may be overlapping jurisdictions. So you can't diminish the authority of another town, village, or on Long Island, the town trustees of any authority that they have for regulating the waters or underwater lands. So this exercise of defining the waterside boundaries sometimes gets into some much more in-depth research on what are those overlapping jurisdictions from other communities, and again, especially on Long Island, and some Hudson River communities as well. And others of you may know of other places where there's overlapping jurisdictions, and that needs to be talked about in the LWRP, what those jurisdictions are and who has jurisdiction over what. Some of those additional jurisdictions that exist in state law are navigation law 46A and town law 130.17, which give municipalities the authority to regulate overwater use, boating and speeds of vessels and things like that. So those were put in place before our harbor management area regulations and the revisions to Article 42. So these things already existed. So some communities have two jurisdictions. So, and then another authority is Navigation Law 46A2, which lists towns and villages. For example, the village of Sackett's Harbor actually already had the authority to regulate construction and location of boathouses, moorings, and docks up to 1,500 feet, even before they had an LWRP. There's a bunch of communities listed in that law, but they wanted to also do an LWRP for the other benefits that can be gained from having an LWRP. So those are the existing authorities that need to be thought about when you're doing that waterside boundary. This I put up again just to show that 911.6 Article 42 says the waterside boundary is within a city, town, or village, or bounding a city, town, or village to that distance of 1,500 feet. And the difference between the village, which could regulate up to 1,500 feet, and the town can regulate all the way to the Canadian border if they wanted to, because that's within their municipal jurisdiction. But again, you can have a smaller regulatory area. You don't have to regulate that whole large area. You can delineate a smaller regulatory area and then codify that in your local law. So how do we then present that boundary in the LWRP document? First, you have to have a map, and that has to show the municipal boundary, the existing state coastal boundary, and proposed revisions. So in the beginning, you'll have a map that's proposed. Also the harbor management area, which is that water side, showing the 1,500 feet and other extraterritorial, in other words, other jurisdictions that also have some laws and regulations that apply that may overlap yours. Name the surface waters, and then adjacent uplands which affect the water bodies. So all this needs to be in the boundary map. And if they're not there, we'll ask you to revise it and resubmit it. So having it in the beginning is very helpful. Then in addition to the map, you need to have a narrative. And this narrative describes that boundary. It doesn't have to be, you know, points, meets and bounds, but it should be a description of, you know, corner of this road and this road to the corner of this road and this road. Or if it's like on the edge of it could be like, say you had a state park, which is a large parcel within your boundary. You could say to the boundary of, to that particular meets and bounds, which is the boundary of that state park land, or and then along the shoreline. And then, so it's more of a narrative description, but that describes it well enough that you can follow it on the map. You also need to have description of any proposed revisions to the coastal boundary. That does not apply to inland waterways. I think that has been misinterpreted by some people. So for inland waterways, you're starting at square one because we don't have a coastal boundary. So inland waterways, you're looking at your waterway and defining and saying, here are my resources and this is why. For the coastal area, if you want to expand it inland, that's you're proposing to revise the coastal boundary. Either way, you need to have clear and justifiable reason for either expanding the coastal boundary or how you want to define your inland waterway boundary. You have to meet those criteria that we talked about, the nexus to the water and important resources. And we'll work with you and advise you on whether these are acceptable to meet the guidelines of the program. We have a checklist that we've developed, and to keep track, we're in section 1 here of your LWRP. So to keep track of all the sections and the requirements that we're talking about in this training, we've developed a fillable PDF, which is Appendix A of the guidance that I sent out to you last night. And we recommend that you use this to make sure that you have all the requirements of the LWRP. This was originally something we used internally, and we decided, and we added the legislative requirements, and we decided it would be good for all of you to use as well. So this is now available it has requirements for section 1, boundaries, section 2, inventory analysis, section 3, how the policy should be put together, section 4, the proposed land and water projects, water uses and projects, section 5, implementation, section 6, our state and federal agency listings, and section 7, consultation and public involvement, and appendices that are needed. And then it has a list of the Article 42 requirements that our attorneys will look for when they're reviewing the LWRP. So we recommend you take a look at this checklist before you start even, and look all the way through it and start thinking about those requirements at the end, the Article 42 requirements that will be looked at when the LWRP is reviewed as you go along in developing the LWRP. Resources for section 1, you have the guidance document I sent out last night, the boundaries on page 16 to 19. There's the checklist in Appendix 1, then those guidelines, the checklist and flow chart for the inland waterway boundary are in Appendix 5. And again, our gateway is a really, really good resource for developing section 1. All right, so I guess this was a little bit shorter than last week. So let's go into the questions. So the first one was, does every LWRP have to also include a harbor management plan? Yes. As when Article 42 was amended in the early 1990s, it said that each LWRP has to include a harbor management plan to be approved. However, some of us, wish that they picked a different name because some communities don't have a defined harbor. But think of it as the water side of your LWRP and the activities that are going on there. So even if you don't have a defined harbor, you might have a small marina or other docking facilities or some other activities going on. Maybe you have a ferry stop, maybe just think of the different ways, different activities you have been going on in the harbor. And the harbor management plan can be integrated into the LWRP rather than a separate section. So what the law says, it can be a separate section as an appendix, or it can be integrated into the other sections. And then there's an appendix. We're going to talk about this when we get to sections 2 and 4. But in the appendix to the guidance, there's an example of a chart where you show section 2 talks about conflict and congestion. Section 3 is the policies, and you reference where that harbor management plan is in the other sections of the LWRP. So that's the way to do it, an easier way to do it, if that makes sense for your community. Okay, question about the CHA, or coastal erosion hazard area boundaries. How does the CHA boundary get included in the LWRP boundary? To my knowledge, all of the coastal erosion hazard areas on the ocean, Long Island, and Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, are already in the coastal boundary as it was defined by the state. If for some reason a CHA wasn't, or a CHA was added, it should be within the coastal boundary of the state. So your LWRP boundary always starts with the existing coastal boundary. And so for the purposes of the CHA, they should already be in there, but your community can propose to amend that boundary. It would be a really important amendment to include that CHA boundary. But it should be, you always start with that coastal boundary. Are there any specific procedures for amending the boundary when adding another municipality? For example, Orleans County LWRP originally had 3 towns, Kendall, Yates, Carlton, decided later on to add Lydenville. So each municipality has their own LWRP boundary. And then each municipality has to adopt that LWRP locally. They can join together to write the LWRP, as those folks have a grant with us to update the LWRP and add Lydenville. But the boundary for each municipality is defined for that municipality. I hope that answered your question. Must an inland waterway be designated as an official designated waterway by the state in order to apply for an LWRP? Yes. And that process we talked about last week, but just in a nutshell, your state senator and state assemblyman propose a bill into the Assembly and Senate, which says we would like to designate this waterway as an inland waterway in Article 42, and these are the reasons why. But just to reiterate, as I said last week, it needs to have public access and activities available for that community by the public on that waterway in a reasonably definable and substantial way to be designated in the waterway for the purposes of our program to do an LWRP. How does a water body be classified as a DIW? I am not sure what DIW means. designated inland waterway. Okay, I guess I just covered that by a bill with your senator or assemblyman. And we don't do that. We look at them once they're submitted, and after the assembly, it gets submitted and they come over to us for review, those bills. But it's a local process. You work with your senator, assemblyman, and your watershed group or your lake group or river group and your municipality to develop and submit that bill with your senator and assemblyman. All right, well, that's all the questions, I believe. And we thank you for coming. We ended a little bit earlier today. Next week, we do have a lot to cover, so we'll definitely be using the whole hour next week on inventory and analysis. And you'll be hearing from me and from Lisa from our program. Okay, so thank you, everybody, and we will see you next week.